Tilea's Troubles, Part 42. Divided, we fall. Outside the walls of Viadaza, Summer's End, 2402. Chapter 1. Deeds Done. The city of Viadaza was belching black clouds, foul and noisome, which drifted eastwards, inland. The dead, both those once undead and those lucky enough never have been stirred post-mortem, were being burned by the thousand. For 2 whole days the Archlector's army had busied itself with piling corpses in the city squares and upon stone-built wharves. Then, after a generous dousing with oil, tar and pitch taken from the warehouses, had set them alight. Within an hour, none could bear to stay within the walls, not only because of the heat, but also the vile, vomit-inducing stench of burning mountains of flesh. The soldiers removed themselves to the sprawling camp outside, where the smoke was lifted by its passage over the walls, then carried by a westerly breeze to pass mostly overhead, only occasionally lowering heavy, greasy coils to sicken those below. The camp contained hundreds of tents and sod-walled huts, in some places arranged tidily, but largely a higgledy-piggledy confusion of differently sized structures placed wheresoever the soldiers had happened to stop. Dotted throughout were fires and braziers, originally intended for cooking and to illuminate the otherwise ominous night, but now heaped with smoking herbs and green sticks, some also sprinkled with incense, in an only partially successful attempt to fend off the awful stink pouring from the city. Near the southern stretch of wall stood a large tent of brightly painted canvas, belonging to the army's military commander, General Urbano d'Alessio, hero of Pontramola. Above it flew 2 flags. The highest, and thus preeminent, was the cross-keyed standard of the Riemann Morite Church, while the lower was the raven-winged hourglass of the Viadazan Crusade, which the general had adopted as a personal standard. The general himself, in almost full armour, casually shouldering the massive blade with which he had slain the vampire Duke of Miragliano, stood before its open front. At his side was Father Biagino, an unassuming Morite priest whom the general had come to recognise was a sturdy ally in the fight against the horrors of the north, being not only insightful and useful, but increasingly influential. It had helped that Biagino was not remotely aloof, as were so many clergy, but willing to suffer a soldier's lot without complaint. Not that Father Biagino looked like a soldier, what with his tonsured hair and a paunch evident even in his loose grey woolen cassock, or that he would describe himself as happy with his lot, for his sleep was racked with nightmares and his waking hours filled with doubts, the 2 difficulties feeding off each other in a miserable spiral. Still, he was resigned to his fate. Having barely left the general's side during the past few days, Biagino was listening to a Riemann captain delivering his report. It was not good news. The captain and his company had been scouting the Trantio road some distance south of Bussala, where he had learned of the sacking of the town of Scorcio by a large force of ogres. He returned quickly to the camp, binding his own men to silence. He knew, however, that there were others with the same story to tell, as he had encountered several groups of fleeing Scorcians on the road, having headed this way not merely because it was the easiest escape route, but because the Holy Army was here, and who better to offer them protection than the soldiers' servants of the gods? "I reckon before it grows dark, the entire army will know," the captain said. "The news is spreading fast, Your Excellency, even as we speak." Biagino felt the now familiar fear welling inside. Yet again, he had dreamed of this, and more than once. His oniric visions had repeatedly twisted this Riemann army and last year's doomed Viadazan crusaders into one, so that the cheers of soldiers celebrating battlefield victory unfailingly transformed into the wails of citizens as yet another town fell to enemies. He had thought the nightmare was born of his weakness, allowing fear and doubt to hold him in their grip. Yet now he saw the truth of it. More had guided his dreams, and although the foe's true face remained hidden, it was revealed that they would strike a terrible blow just as the Riemanns' backs were turned, and so turn victory into defeat. The general drew all that he could from the captain, learning that the ogres had issued from Campagrotta, bolstered by mercenaries from over the eastern mountains, and that they had looted the town as thoroughly as they had done to every settlement in the city-state of Ravola, and that their leader was Razgaboldaguts, the tyrant general commanding the mysterious wizard lord Nicolo's forces. He then turned to Biagino. "What happens then, father, when this news does the rounds in the camp?" Biagino frowned. "It does not bode well for harmony among an army of allies. If Scorcio is fallen, then the young Lord Silvano may no longer wish to march with us. He was made ruler of Trantio by his father, which makes Scorcio his responsibility." "Aye, but his father stole the realm of Trantio," said the general. "And now the brutes are doing so too. I do wonder if there really is any difference." Biagino nodded. "I understand, General. Yet I do not think the young lord will see it that way. I've spoken to him. Lord Silvano idolises his father, sees neither greed nor cruelty in him, only stern nobility. He himself told me how his father humbled the Astianans when they threatened to strangle Pavolan trade, then marched north to remove a warmongering tyrant from Trantio, thus freeing its people. To his eyes, his father is a noble and honourable hero, destined to become the stuff of myth and legend, while these ogres will surely seem nothing more than base and cruel robbers." "Well," said the general, "Lord Silvano would be right about the ogres at least, and they won't stop at looting and plunder. They'll probably eat the populace too. Yet, father, I too have spoken with Silvano, and I'm not so sure he would leave us now, for that would mean forsaking his oath to serve more in this our holy war." "It is not what has already been done that will move the young lord, but what is about to happen," said Biagino. "Considering what was done to Ravola, Razgaboldaguts probably considers Scorcio a mere aperitivo, which makes the city of Trantio his main course. How can Lord Silvano remain with us when he is obliged to protect Trantio?" "Ah!" laughed General D'Alessio. "He's honour bound to serve us here. Besides considerations of his duty and oath, even if he did leave this very night, he could not hope to reach Trantio in time to save it from destruction." "He's young and hopeful, General, and will likely try anyway." "Aye, probably so," agreed D'Alessio. He pondered a moment, never one to rush when speaking, despite his renowned dexterity in combat. "Silvano fought beside the Campagrottan brutes in the battle, did he not?" Biagino had forgotten that. Yes, he did. They fought the undead riders together, and for some time, before he was saved by the intervention of his foot soldiers. "So," the general said carefully, "while he and the brute stood together against the foe, the brute's own cousins were attacking his possessions to the south. It seems to me that there is a cruel and clever cunning at play here. This Campagrottan wizard lord sends his soldiers, man and ogre, to join our holy army, and then, when the Pavonan lord marches north with us and them, the wizard lord's ogres begin plundering the now undefended towns. Thus he fights as both the Pavonans' ally and enemy at one and the same time." Biagino now wondered about the wizard lord Nicolo Bentiglovio, remembering his niggling doubts in the past. Driven from his realm many decades ago, Nicolo had returned unnaturally old and retaken it with an army of mercenary ogres. Could he, in fact, be a vampire? Would that explain his remarkable longevity? If so, perhaps there was an alliance between him and the vampires to the west, which would conceivably lead to exactly this sort of strategic manipulation. Perhaps the wizard lord and the other vampires intended to carve out Tilea between them. Biagino did not, however, voice these concerns, for if he was correct, then he had no doubt the general would work it out for himself, and if he was wrong, he did not want to further promulgate a misconception. Besides, he had dreamed nothing of the sort, and so had no reason to believe this particular insight was gifted by More. The general was also lost in thought, scraping the edge of his shouldered sword against his steel pauldron as he did so. Finally, he announced, "It seems we are to be tested in even more ways than I imagined, and I thought I'd imagined the worst. We are now surrounded by enemies, to the north and the south, and even if I chose not to divide the army in response, it could well do so of its own accord. Furthermore, we have potential enemies in our midst, a whole battalion of Campagrottans. Clearly, we must take measures to ensure they can do us no harm. I shall speak with His Holiness." The Riemann captain coughed. Not the sort of racking cough gifted by the miasma emanating from the city, but short and sharp. Both general and priest looked at him. "Yes?" inquired the general. "Beg pardon, your excellency, but the Pavonans already know what has happened. I saw considerable fuss in their camp as I came here to you, and they look to be readying themselves." "Leaving already, without my permission?" asked the general. "They look to be arming themselves for a fight," said the captain, "not preparing to march." Suddenly Biagino understood. "They'll be wanting vengeance against the Campergrottan brutes in our army," he suggested. "They've been tricked, mocked even, what with the brutes helping their young lord in battle. All Pavonans are proud, even the common soldiers. They believe their faith is more perfect than anyone else's, so that all they do is right and proper. If they can hate dwarfs so much as to banish them from their realm, how much more will they hate these brutes? It is likely they will expect us to thank them for the slaughter that they're about to cause." "We must act now," said the general. "There's no time for an audience with His Holiness." He turned to the Riemann captain and the Cathayan officer by his side. "Gentlemen, muster your men and make haste about it. Not only do we need to restrain the Campergrottans, we must get between them and the Pavonans. If we act quickly, we might prevent this army mortally wounding itself." Chapter 2. Vengeance. While the general's soldiers marched to the Campergrottan quarter, Father Biagino hurried away to find young Lord Silvano. The lad had always seemed amenable and honest, perhaps too much so for the world of Tilean politicking, and Biagino hoped to persuade him to order his men to stand down. Near the Pavonan camp, the stinking smoke thickened as the breeze died away, and the noisome pall descended to linger more stubbornly. Looking around, Biagino quickly realised he was probably too late. There was hardly anyone about. The soldiers had already gone. Outside Lord Silvano's pavilion, there was but one guard, and a wounded man hobbling near the huts. "I wish to speak with Lord Silvano," said Biagino. The guard, a large and mustachioed fellow, sniffed. "Not here," he answered, a rudely brief reply, considering he was addressing a priest of Moor. "Then where is he?" The guard grinned. "Gone to teach the Campergrottans a lesson in manners, and not the kind they'll get to put into practice later." Biagino pelted off through the camp as fast as his legs could carry him. He'd never been much of a runner, and the thickly fouled air did not make it any easier. But then, he hoped, it may have slowed the Pavonans down too. As he approached the rocky outcrop behind which the Campergrottans had settled, he could hear shouting. Unwilling to hurtle into the middle of a skirmish, he slowed his pace and picked his way more carefully between the huts. The first Pavonans he saw were handgunners, making ready their pieces. Halting, he consoled himself that he had not yet heard any shots. The fighting had not yet begun. He stepped back, then crept behind the huts in the direction the Pavonans had been facing. Crouching behind a large barrel, he peered over to see what exactly was confronting them. He was much reassured to see that it was a body of the Archlector's Cathayan guards. They had arrayed themselves to block this particular access to the Campergrottans' camp, an opening in one of the many rocky ridges that peppered the land around the city. As the Pavonans were not moving off elsewhere, he assumed there must be other loyal troops blocking the other gaps, no doubt facing more bands of angry Pavonans. The Cathayans had formed into a double rank of crossbows, their first rank kneeling, while behind them stood a body of soldiers armed with the odd-looking polearms they favoured. An officer and a sergeant stood beside them, while their banner, bearing a single Morite key, fluttered above. It was not them who were doing the shouting. The Pavonans stood close, so close in fact that a volley from the crossbows now would surely prove very bloody, very deadly. They were disorganised, and although neatly liveried in their blue and white, as always, they looked more like a rabble than a body of soldiers ready for battle. Biagino wondered if this was because they were unofficered, acting without orders, without direction. They certainly seemed to lack discipline. As well as handgunners, he could see halberdiers and swordsmen, muddled together, and all as tense as an angry crowd set upon lynching a suspected felon. Some Pavonans were coughing, the stench here threatening to overwhelm them, but all had drawn their blades or were preparing their handguns. Biagino looked around to see who was doing the shouting. He'd already decided it was not Silvano. If the young lord was here, was he merely watching, or was he with another mob at another gap between the rocks? Perhaps he'd lost control of his unruly soldiers, whether unwillingly or not. Just then, Biagino spotted the man doing the shouting, a stern-looking fellow, armed with a somewhat oversized hammer and pistol, which nevertheless he wielded with ease. By the steel plate hanging at the man's chest, Biagino recognised him as a provost. Trust the Pavonans, he thought, to have a provost who stirs up trouble rather than quelling it. The man was agitated, more so even than the mob behind him, and straining to shout while breathing the poisoned fumes clogging the camp.
"This is folly," he yelled. "Why would you defend such villains? You have no right to bar our way. I would see justice done here this day, yet you would protect them. Their very presence here befouls this our holy army. Perhaps you do not see it, for you yourselves know not the glory of more. Your lack of faith is a lack of understanding. Ask yourselves, what is all this to you? Well, I shall tell you, it is Tilean business, Pavonan business. You have no right to prevent us meting out proper justice." The Cathayan captain spoke with a heavy accent, and much more calmly than the provost. "We have our orders. You are to return to your camp. The matter is in hand." "It is not. While those abominations live, justice is ill-served. They are enemies, who have raised their hand against our prince. Would you have us let them be? Stand idle in the face of their guilt?" Behind him, the Pavonan soldiers' protests grew louder, yet they did not press any further forward. "You are not arguing with me," said the Cathayan, "but with General Delesio, whom your master has accepted as his military commander, and who serves in turn the Archlector. It is by the general's order that we are here. Leave now, or I will give the order to shoot." The Pavonan provost laughed. "The Archlector is not the apex of power, but Holy More, who is above all men and all officers, above all gods. It is not for the likes of you to tell Tileans how to cleanse their own land and make it good in the eyes of More." He turned to his men, raising his hand, then shouted, "Handgunners, to the fore! Form on me! 2 ranks!" The handgunners began to move hesitantly forwards, while the others stepped aside to get out of their way. Just then a sound was heard from beyond the rocks. A growling roar, at once both angry and pained. The Cathayan officer turned to look. Biagino was impressed that not one of his soldiers so much as stole a glance, instead remaining fixed and at the ready, awaiting orders, the very definition of discipline. The advancing Pavonans halted, uncertain, straining to peer beyond the ranks of Cathayans. Biagino could not be certain, but it had sounded a lot like an ogre.